One of the most dangerous ideas we've considered today is the idea that only Americans can tell us what's dangerous. We've had 4 sessions in a row, each from articulate, passionate, interesting Americans. We've talked about monogamy, we've talked about outsourcing, we've talked about conspiracies, and we've talked about the patriarchy. And it seems appropriate after that roll call to end the day talking about America and what's wrong with America and the ways in which it's fundamentally failed. Tonight's session will see one of America's most incendiary writers, a man who's revolutionized television as we know it. He's going to deliver a brief talk, then if I can contain myself and remember my words, he and I will have a conversation for a little while and then we'll throw it out to you. I will remind you the proceedings tonight are being filmed for both the Wheeler Centre website and for the NSA. So when you're asking a question, can you ask it in a microphone? That would be great. Also, make it a question. There's a thought. So welcome to some people are more equal than others. Once upon a time, if you'd been looking for a dangerous idea, the last place you would have looked was television. Entertainment and corporate interests as your guiding principles hardly makes for a risk or social challenge. But times have changed, and David Simons is not your standard television writer. The self-proclaimed angriest man in America, Simons' writing comes from the same place as his many years of journalism, a place of deep humanism and an unflinching sense of justice and injustice. He was born in Washington and moved to Baltimore in 1983 to work as a crime reporter at the Baltimore Sun, and that was a post he held for 12 years. While at the paper, he reported and wrote 2 works of narrative non-fiction, Homicide, A Year on the Killing Streets, and The Corner, A Year in the Life of an Inner City Neighbourhood. The former was an account of a year spent with the City Homicide Squad, the latter a year spent on a West Baltimore drug corner. But it was in the translation of those works to television that David Simon became known to a wider audience. Anyone who's seen The Wire or any of the other TV he's been involved with, Homicide, The Corner, Generation Kill, and Treme, knows that the accolades are deserved, and there's no writer working today better placed to talk about the fundamental inequalities of American society. I'm going to leave my final words for this introduction to writer and sometime David Simon collaborator Richard Price. He wrote an introduction to a re-release of Homicide, A Year on the Killing Streets, and the introduction ended with the following words. All of which is to say that if Edith Wharton came back from the dead, developed a bent for municipal power brokers, cops, crackheads, and reportage, and didn't really care what she wore to the office, she'd probably look a little something like David Simon. Please welcome David Simon.
Wow. Thank you very much. My father, who was a man of sensible ideas, reasonable ideas, he would have said, wear a tie, wear a jacket, be a mensch. He would have said, don't wear those shoes. He also would have said, you're talking to people who don't know you. You're going to be a nice venue, it's supposed to be serious. Don't say the bad words. Don't use the bad words. Unfortunately, I work for HBO and I'm on contract to them, so every 14th word will have to be a profanity. So if you came here hoping for some decorum, you're shit out of luck. Sorry. My wife will also tell you, she's here tonight, she's instructed not to get in my eye line, because if anybody here has ever done any public speaking, you know that if you see somebody who knows you, they can look right through the pretense of who you're pretending, you're pretending to be somebody, there's this, as you can see, there's a certain amount of shtick, and if you catch that eye line, you know that they've heard it all before, and that everything you say is, they can see the seams where you sewed it together. So she will tell you that my most dangerous idea is when it's appropriate to leave for the airport to catch a flight. Nothing I tell you today will strike her as the least bit dangerous. She's all that nonsense. She's tuned out long ago. But they gave me. I didn't actually write the headline there. many of you will recognize it if you've read Animal House or Orwell, or at least if you have the Cliff Notes, you'll recognize it as the culminating line of betrayal from the porcine Politburo. It's said seriously by them, but sardonically by Orwell. So I'm not sure I'm supposed to defend that. That just is. That is something that's becoming increasingly clear in my country, and I think throughout the West, as capitalism, late stage capitalism, as it stratifies. And ultimately, I think what I'm here to deliver is the idea that, I think my real dangerous idea is to sort of invert that and say, there's this guy, Karl Marx, who became sort of the laughingstock of the 20th century. He's kind of like the MC Hammer of socioeconomic thought. He had a kick-ass hit that just, rocketed straight to the top of the charts, and everybody was, what's this guy going to do next? Russia, China, domino theory. I mean, he's good to go. And then there was sort of a follow-up, a little bit of a brag, kind of a "we will bury you, Khrushchev." You may remember "Too Legit to Quit," but nobody remembers the third single. By the time, Marx came out with his third, they were knocking down the Berlin Wall, and they were basically saying, well, that's for the ash heap. And they tossed it all on the ash heap. They threw down everything that the guy ever said. And I certainly did too, in the sense that, capitalism is, at this point and going forward, the only practical means of producing mass wealth. In our world, the way markets work and the way human beings have trended and the way governments deal with economic issues, nobody's going back to a fully state-sponsored, state-operated economy. But that doesn't mean that Marx didn't have his finger on the pulse of something. If you've read Capital, he's a very good diagnostician about what capitalism is capable of if it's not married to a social compact, if it's not connected to some other metrics other than profit. He saw that one coming, and he saw it beautifully, and if you read the parts that are just diagnoses for what he was witnessing in industrial England at the time of the Industrial Revolution, you realize that his criticisms of capitalism, or at least unrestrained capitalism, are kind of unanswered. Or, sadly, I think for the last few years, maybe we're starting to realize that we're answering them by proving him right. He's a terrible clinician. He's a terrible, his prescriptions don't quite work. And that's really what the 20th century proved, is that, if you look at what he presumed would happen in a purely socialist state, it's downright silly. I mean, things like the withering away of the state, people benignly giving up the power they wielded to make everyone equal. Orwell had his number. So you look at that and you say, okay, the state-run economy doesn't work, but does capitalism work? Does pure capitalism? If you leave everything up to the markets, if the only metric you have for measuring the health of your society is the quarterly report, what happens then? And if you're honest about it, and you stand outside of labels, you stop saying I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, I'm a capitalist, I'm a Marxist, I'm a libertarian, I'm this, I'm that. If you get rid of all that, you start to realize that actually it's the people who are basically just pragmatists, who are sort of seeking to take what works and what doesn't work and to strain those two things away from each other without regard to the labels. The labels are crippling. I don't give this talk for very long without saying, and I'm about to say it right now, the one thing that gets me off the hook, which is I'm not a Marxist. And I'm not preaching pure Marxism. Because if I don't say that, I'm marginalized in any discussion in my own country and probably throughout the West. Maybe a little less so in Europe, but definitely in my country, you know, you're down at the end of the dial at the end of that. But that which works actually in our society has been demonstrated in the 20th century. And my country demonstrated it, which was to say markets were free, and personal incentive was rewarded, and there was no limitation of personal ambition. And at the same time, when things really went wrong and capital demonstrated that it was incapable of producing a just society in which everybody was vested in that society, regardless of whether you were working class or upper class, they applied socialism, and very effectively in the form of the New Deal and later the Great Society, and we basically did both things, not to the exclusion of each other, but in concert with each other. We created a social safety net and a social paradigm in which labor also mattered to building the country. In my country, the great John Lewis, the great mine workers president, he said the future of America is the future of labor. And sadly, he was exactly right, which is why our future is, I think, quite bleak for the moment, economically. Doing both and eschewing the labels was, I think, what made the American century, for lack of a better term. I know it's a little offensive to be throwing that around, but it's what made us into the economic engine we were. And it wasn't just because labor was allowed to bargain collectively and collective bargaining was protected and codified by the government. That was part of it, but it was also that when they did do that, when there was this tension between capital and labor, and you ended up with workers actually earning more than a subsistence wage and having discretionary income, we took a working class that had no money or just barely enough money to buy what it needed to survive, and we made it into a middle class, an incredible consumer class that drove the economy so that people were not just buying all the shit that they needed to live, they were buying all the shit they didn't need. And therein lies the power of the American economy. We'll sell you what you do need, and then we'll go out and sell you a lot of what you don't need, and we'll manufacture it. And that made that power, the tension between capital and labor, was what made the economy work. Somewhere around exactly 1980, and the PATCO strike, the air traffic controller strike in my country, labor became a bad word. Nobody would say Karl Marx wasn't a bad word, but as long as you stayed away from anything that even suggested that labor might be something other than a cost, you were okay. But unions were not a bad word, and the idea of this constant tension between capital and labor was assumed. It's not assumed anymore. And with that tension having gone out of the economy, it's now a race to the bottom for family earning power, for the American worker, and you're seeing this elsewhere around the country now, in other countries as well in the West. I'm well aware that you have your own economic dynamic, and it may not have hit you here yet, but at some point, when capital wins unequivocally, and when they win all the battles, labor by definition has to be diminished. And it may happen more slowly in Australia or in other places in the world, but eventually it's a race to the bottom. If somewhere on the globe there is a worker who you can pay less and profit more, and if profit is your only metric, then we're all going to less. We're not going to more. And that's really what The Wire was about. It was an allegory for a world in which human beings every day are worth less. They're worth less. Regardless of their expertise, regardless of their role in society, regardless of whether they were serving the real economy or the overt political dynamic or the underground economy of drugs. Every day, the average person was worth less. That doesn't mean, since it's a big pyramid scheme, some people are worth more, if they're closer to the top of the pyramid, and certainly there's no justice in that. I mean, for example, TV writers are worth more, but it's not the way it's supposed to be. And that notion of human beings being perceived as merely a cost has been embraced by the West. And we've bought into this completely. And ultimately, the only chance we have now is if at some point we start to turn back that clock. Well, the lever by which we did it after the Depression was through the electoral process. But bad news there, because in my country, the electoral process has been purchased. The last thing on Capital's agenda, after it had won every single fight with labor it needed to win, and after it had diminished labor, was to purchase the reins of power and the means of reform so that they don't have to go through that again. They don't want the pendulum to swing back. So if you've been watching what passes for governance in my country, which is at this point slapstick, then you're looking at it and saying, these guys can't even do public health insurance. This presumed world leader of a country, this place where democracy is supposed to be demonstratively viable, they can't figure out how to provide basic health care for their population without it devolving into a screaming match over what is socialism and what is the taint of socialism. I watch this. I watch what happens, in the dynamic, and I'm just astonished because we all believe in group health insurance in my country. You get it, wherever you work. You work at a university, you work for the police department, you work for the firefighters. Your union gives you group health insurance. What the fuck do you think group health insurance is other than socialism? If socialism is the taint that you can't, if you're so ideologically pure that the notion that other Americans might share in the risk and benefits of a health plan, if that's the taint of socialism, then be true to your word and don't get don't sign up for group health and get a check out the next time you're in the hospital for 2 weeks. And write the check to the hospital and write the check to all the doctors and take out a third mortgage. The notion that became an argument over being stained by the accusation of socialism is astonishing to me. Because everybody wants to be a socialist. They want to be in a good group health care plan. They don't want to pay for the other guy. And therein you have the rise of what really is the most astonishing political philosophy of our time. That libertarianism, which is human selfishness, gathered up and made into a political theory. I got here alone, my money's my money, you get yours, I got mine, and government is bad. No. First of all, government is inevitable unless you're unless you're in Somalia, in which case, good luck holding on to all of your nickels and dimes. But bad government is bad. Good government is good. And if we're pretending or presuming to representative government, then let's put the proper pronoun in front of it and say, either your government is good or your government is bad. And that's predicated not on you walking away from government, but you acknowledging that government is you. It is an extension of the collective representation of the people living under it. If you no longer believe in that, all right, then get a gun and go to Idaho or shoot up the TSA at LAX or start the revolution. But if you're presuming that it is a nation of laws you want to live under, then it's your nation of laws if it's representative. The fact that a lot of Americans no longer believe this, and that they've actually constructed a philosophical argument for detaching from the rest of society is indicative of how late it is and how the 21st century will not be an American century. It really comes down to this. It comes down to the pragmatism of taking that which works when you make a social compact, when you say we're all in this together and we're not leaving anybody behind, and applying those things to the engine that is capitalism. And realizing that capitalism has been mistaken for something it can never be for the last 30 years. As I said, we're not getting by without capitalism. It's the tool in the toolbox that produces mass wealth in this modern world, as nothing else does. But it's only that. It's an engine for producing wealth. And when you try to make it into a blueprint for a just society, it's completely useless. It has no relevance to that, and the metrics by which we determine whether or not something is capitalistically viable, it's not whether it makes the environment better, it's not whether it gets everybody health care, it's not whether it prevents child abuse it's profit. And that the naive and embarrassing notion that by letting the market be, by intervening in the management of resources and human beings to a minimum, the market will solve all of our problems. No, it won't. It'll make the rich richer. It'll make the poor poorer. If you don't marry it to something that says, listen, and you actually see, this is the beautiful thing, you actually see the left and the center of the political spectrum trying to justify things that are merely good and worthy and honorable by saying, you'll save money if you do this. I admire Al Gore, for example, for being, committing himself to great environmental argument and great environmental passion. But every now and then he starts to talk about what the money will save if we are environmentally sound, if we're environmentally protective. And I want to jump up and say, Al, no, it costs more money not to pollute. It really does. It costs more money to have less bad stuff coming out of the smokestack or to keep the chemicals, to not just dump them in a creek, but to actually mitigate that. You're not doing it to save money. You're doing it because you need to do it, because human existence requires that we do these things. It costs money. It's a cost. Accept it. Unless what you're saying is everything has to be justified by whether or not it maximizes profit. The fact that that capitalism has changed the terms of engagement so that you don't even have to pretend anymore that something being merely good for people. Somebody just said to me something about Australia. They said, every program you see coming out of Canberra, there's always a cost report. And the last one that he noted, I'm trying to remember who told it. Did you tell me this? Yeah, Michael might have told me this. But it really struck me. I went home last night thinking about it. It said there was a cost report for trying to minimize, reduce the cases of child abuse in the country. And why? What possible cost would a healthy society not undertake to reduce to significantly reduce child abuse? You really need the cost report? In the event, the gamesmanship that has twisted the political argument to the point of saying the markets will solve all, don't get in the way of the markets, is astonishing. So The Wire really was about these people in a metropolis where labor has been diminished and they've lost all the fights, and human beings are worthless. And indeed, some of the darkest things that have happened in my country, the war on drugs, for example, has become a stat game and a means of monetizing the poor. Because here's the real scary thing about when people become worthless is that you don't need as many of them. Between automation and between the manufacturing base of my country shifting to overseas, we don't need 10 or 15% of Americans to run our economy, to run our service economy. Most of them are people of color. Most of them are poorly educated. They're from the inner cities. And the last factory still hiring in places like West Baltimore or East St. Louis or North Philadelphia is the drug corner. That's the last factory of hope. You know, and I say that with, you know, all the Orwellian precision that I can. And there too, Wall Street has stepped in and seen a way to make money off of the destruction, which is to say, let's privatize prisons. You know, what could be more a sign of a decadent society than creating a product that we'll call incarceration and having companies, publicly traded companies. So we're all investing our pension plans and our retirement plans and our 401ks into mutual funds that are buying stock in a company that is running to a Wall Street analyst, and the analyst is saying, what can you promise me over the next year? And the CEO is saying, I think we can raise profits 8%. How do you fucking raise profits 8% if your product is incarceration, except by locking up more people, which is exactly what they do? Two biggest growth populations in the United States of America, which is now the most incarcerative society in the history of mankind. We jail more of our people by percentage and by raw numbers than China. And of course, China is working with 2 billion, we're working with 300,000. How do you do this? Well, we're not getting any more violent. In fact, we're getting less violent. When I started as a police reporter in the early 80s, 35% of the federal prison population was violent offender. Now it's down to 7%. The rest is nonviolent. The two big growth groups, nonviolent drug offenses and people trying to move to a better life, i.e. illegal immigrants being held for detention prior to deportation. That's where the money is. So then these companies that have promised to hit their number to the Wall Street analysts, they then rush to the state legislatures and they lobby for 3 strikes you're out laws, for harsher sentences for simple drug sales, drug possession charges. And that's their chow, that's their fuel to make their number. And, you know, I understand here in Australia you guys have gone to for-profit systems. Obviously, nobody's paying attention to what America has done to itself, because, you know, no sensate person could look at us and say, I want to be like them. I want to do that. You know, not only, by the way, there's also, the joke is the prisons themselves are not that much cheaper than if they were just run by the state. But never mind that. Again, that's me. I just did what I always criticize. I just put the cost report in there in front of you. But think about it as this. Locking somebody up is a fundamental failure and a costly one for society. It should be what you do when you can't think of what else to do. But in my country, it's something that is offered up as a potentiality for profit. Of course, the country's paying for it. I mean, we're all paying for it in taxes. And the same thing with healthcare. You know, we're all paying for the people who wash up at emergency rooms without insurance. You know, the society pays for it in the end, but someone out there along the way has figured out how to make these human beings into profit centers. And they do. And so the drug war isn't a war on drugs. It hasn't reduced narcotics use in my country, or you know, which is actually not any greater than it was over the last 25 years. It hasn't taken back a single drug corner. The drugs are still as pure as they were. They're actually purer than they were when I started as a police reporter. It hasn't achieved a single goal. And yet, it's gotten a lot of politicians elected for being hard on crime, and it's made a lot of people money. And it's created its own universe, its own industry. I don't know how you get out of this except through reform and through electing the right people and having somebody do the right thing. And there, between the partisan rancor and the inability of actually good men of conscience to maneuver within that political structure, and the fact that we have relatively brief terms of between election, 2 or 4 years for our national legislature. And everybody requires money to maintain their status as elected officials. Elections are about money and little else. I don't see it changing. I mean, here's the real scary thing is, in 32 it changed. Roosevelt came in, he said, there's a new deal, we're all going back to work. And what he was effectively saying is, all of us are in this together. The economy has crashed and burned, but we're either all crawling out of the pile or none of us are. And he figured out a way to manufacture jobs where there were no jobs, and to spend in true Keynesian fashion, and to instill a sense of community and a sense of hope. I believe you guys here would call it mateship, right? He actually had a moment of a societal compact that was the equivalent of American mateship. And it worked. It worked. It took probably the moment where capitalism was at its most vulnerable in the 20th century, where people had started to disbelieve in the potentiality of anything other than state-sponsored economy. And it managed to preserve those pieces while grafting on socialist impulses. And he did it. He got elected, and the people in his party got elected, and it was plausible to do that because capital had not fully arrived to purchase the American political system. I think the only way we get out of this now is it gets so bad that somebody finally picks up a brick. I hate to say that, but I'm not sure that I see another means of reform. In any event, I think it's astonishing. The dangerous idea here is that Marx, for all of the grand misplay of state-sponsored communism in the 20th century, for all the farcical outcome of, for all the brutality of Stalinism and the failed cultural revolution of Mao, and all the ways in which communism demonstrated that it wasn't equipped to actually generate sufficient wealth and sufficient production to sustain a society. Capitalism is managing through its greed, through its inability to move towards the center and adopt a social compact and embrace a social compact and say, you know what, we won't make the last possible dollar for the quarterly report. We'll leave some money on the table, but we'll put workers out there that can actually afford to buy some of these products. Because capitalism has turned to basically a plutocracy and in some ways, a kleptocracy. Because that's happened, they're actually going to they're in danger of seizing defeat from the jaws of victory. They won the 20th century. They came out of World War II with the obvious best product. All they needed to do was keep doing what they were doing, and instead, they butchered it. We've butchered it. And this Marx fellow, who was consigned to the ash heap of history, if you go back and read what he actually wrote, at least in a diagnostic way, about what capital is capable of, if you don't marry it to something that is more about the human condition and about human need and about human dignity, it's capable of incredible brutality and incredible waste and incredible indifference. And we're seeing that in my society. So The Wire was an argument for that. And having said something, having left you at the point of somebody picking up a brick, which is, I can't imagine a better bring down for this lovely room, I guess I'm going to conclude and let us all talk about Omar and how and how cool he is. And or let the ladies tell me why I shouldn't have killed Stringer Bell. But the truth is, I would have, I know there's a lot of people here who would like to talk about The Wire, but I would have felt bad in the Festival of Dangerous Ideas coming in and saying, yes, let's talk about a TV show. But that really was our reason for doing it. My country no longer works. And it's not that we've had a recession or that we've made a few mistakes or that the drug war's gotten a little out of hand. 50% of the African American males in my city of Baltimore have been without work. That number is held for about 20, 25 years now. The rates of unemployment for black males is close to 50%. It's above 50% right now. That's not an economic system that's struggling. That's something that doesn't work. You know, if we're all not vested, then it's going to be ugly. So I don't know that you guys are along that continuum very far. I'm astonished at how fast things are changing in my country and how incapable the government is of addressing that, or of even recognizing the depth of the problem. You know, they're arguing about, it's a little bit of deck furniture on the Titanic. So I would like to come with something better than the brick, because that truly is a dangerous idea. And especially if you're the one who gets hit by the brick. You know, the brick is never precise. But at some point, if your government is incapable of creating a social compact where everybody feels like they're an American and that matters, we're all not going to make the same money. Some of us are going to be venture capitalists. Some of us are going to, get the vacation home in the Porsche and see the game on the widescreen on Saturdays, and some of us are not. But if it's nothing but a rigged game, and you can't even look at your kids and say, okay, you might not get everything, but there's going to be a portion of this for you, and you'll be there at the end of the week, and we'll be there in the same place. If you can't even guarantee that to what's left of your middle class and your working class, there's not much more credibility left on your road in government. And so, don't do as we did. Run like hell. I wish I could say something better, and I wish I could offer something more than the brick, but right now, after watching these knuckleheads, arguing over whether default would be bad or not, as if the dollar doesn't even mean anything anymore, as if it's just a theory, I can't really give you much optimism, other than that Hollywood is recession-proof. So, regardless of how bad it gets, I get to be fine. So, on that note.
I can just picture people saying, so what do you want to do on Sunday night? Let's get some dinner and be told that we're fundamentally worthless and that it's all going down the drain. And I think we delivered on that.
It's all up here from, now it's all it gets beautiful right now.
There you go again, giving a shit when it's not your turn to give a shit.
That's right. Very good.
I want to start with your life as a newspaperman, because I'm fascinated by the extent to which the passion with which you spoke there, the kind of the lines of curiosity in your TV seems to come entirely from that place as you as a newspaperman. I understand you knew you wanted to be one from 12, 13?
About 13, yeah.
Yeah. And what was it about that life? Why was it that you wanted more than anything else?
My father wanted to be a newspaperman. He was briefly, very briefly, before World War II. When he came out of the Army, he already had a kid, and he got a job in public relations, and it never really happened. But it was a house where we took every newspaper in the Washington area, even all three of them, and the New York Times on Sundays, and we argued and argued and argued about current events or economics or politics, or arguing in my brother said it very well one time. He said, arguing in this family is sport. And it really was. And you came to dinner on Friday night ready to plant your flag somewhere. Sometimes, not because there was that much difference. We were all, lefty New Deal Democrats. But, the hardest arguments were usually like, Bobby Kennedy, no, Gene McCarthy, it's a very limited spectrum of liberalism. But nobody was taking Nixon, But sometimes you would, And when you could, you would do it just to be contrary, because the act of arguing, rhetoric, was, when it was legit, was sort of prized in my family. And my dad made me love, I had conversations with my dad about the writers he admired, and he would pull stuff down off the shelf and say, and literally parse how Haywood Broun or Swope or Damon Runyon told a story. And he made newspapers seem like everybody was a character and it was all going to be wonderful, and you would take over a bar, and you'd all go to that bar to be the newspaper bar, and you'd all hang out talking about the stories that you just filed, and it was going to be wonderful. And of course, when I got to an actual newspaper, it was a very staid newspaper in Baltimore, and we didn't even have a bar. And there weren't that many characters. There were a lot of sort of normal, college-educated, not everybody had a bottle of gin in their desk, which, so he made it a content. I understood newspapers at a very early age. I understood the dynamic. So I got infected very early, I would say.
Did you keep associating newspapers with having an argument? Was it an opportunity to push
Absolutely.
that argument forward?
I think newspapers, any day that people are arguing about something in a newspaper, and the argument is worthwhile, it's because the newspaper presented something that's not simplistic, that's complex, that has 2 sides to it, or 3 sides, or 4 sides, and it's worth arguing about. To the extent that newspapers fail to do that, and they're failing more and more often for reasons that have to do with journalism, and its status in the world right now, something goes out of the world. Something goes out of the culture of the political culture of a society. Argument's good. I'm into argument. Argument has always made the script work better in the writer's room. It's honed, the bad ideas get beaten up and the good ideas triumph, for the most part. And argument is good. I mean, as long as it's sort of good argument. If it's just name calling, if it's the stuff that you see on the bottom of newspaper websites where people are just calling names and no, that's not an argument. It's
occasionally cathartic, but not an argument.
Yeah, it might be cathartic, but a good ranging argument is something to value because invariably something new comes out of it, or some shading that you didn't think about before. At least I think so. My wife, God bless her, she may feel differently about this arguing thing. I don't know. She's very good at it, though, in her own way.
So if you knew you wanted to be a newspaper man, and part of that was about the argument, being posted to the crime desk when you started, how did that shape the kind of newspaper man you were, and how did that shape your sense of justice in society?
At first, I was just so ecstatic to be hired. I was hired at a newspaper right out of college at the Sun, a lucky series of events. And they put me on the night police shift, 4 to 12. And at first, I was just happy, my first couple of years were just clip after clip of, police said, this happened last night. One story indistinguishable from another. Maybe not 2 years, but certainly the first year. And I didn't have, my ambition had at that point been fulfilled. I got hired by the Baltimore Sun, and it was just wondrous to see your byline, just like, look at that, a byline and then 8 inches on a 3-alarm fire, it's right there, it's immortality. What happened was a reporter, I can actually name him, at some point he was the night editor on the weekends when I was working those shifts. A guy named Bob Benjamin, he handed me a copy of Let Us Now Praise Famous Men by James Agee with the Walker Evans photographs. And I read that, and all of a sudden I realized, you know what, there might actually be a why to why we're doing this every night. Maybe the why matters, why people are poor, why prisons don't work, why the schools never get better. Maybe the why is what might make this a grown-up thing to do after a while. So.
I mean, the thing that really characterizes Agee's writing, and Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, is this extraordinary relationship of trust between the people he's writing about.
Yes.
and him. You know, he gets in amongst these people who have no reason to trust him, a journalist coming into their lives, and
he's so
it's
different
so raw.
from them. He's so different from them. He's a New Yorker, very elegant. Butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. You know, he moves in Manhattan circles very easily among writers and artists, and they're dirt farmers, and it's the Depression, and yet so you know, you go into a neighborhood like that, unless you're a complete asshole, you're going to be able to peer into these people's lives and put it all on display in any manner you see fit. And when I was reading the book, not only was I astonished to have these incredibly palpable humans and their lives described journalistically, but to see that the care with which A.G. attempted that, and his concern for the humanity of the people he was writing about. It's an altogether amazing book, and it sold about 2,000 copies when Houghton Mifflin put it. I think it was 1939, 1940, but it didn't sell very well at all. But it's regarded as a classic today.
So that book changed the kind of journalism you wanted to do, the kind of journalist you wanted to be?
I remember thinking before my first book was about, I went into the homicide unit in Baltimore for a year. I convinced somebody in power to let me into that unit on one shift. And the reason I did was, having written all of those, you know, a 19-year-old West Baltimore man was shot yesterday in the 1200 block of Durham Street. Police have no witnesses, no motive, no suspect. You know, into the, you know, page D2. Having done that 700 times, I looked at the homicide unit and thought, there's got to be another way to slice this, to tell the story so that there's actually some flesh and blood, so you feel some human beings. So that was just a way of telling us, you know, making it into a story about what was actually happening. And what was happening was sort of, it wasn't violence as murder matters, you know, it wasn't Agatha Christie and, you know, every murder has a solution. And it was violence and the response to violence as a societal assembly line. It was give the case a shake for 2 days, 3 days, and then, you know, then there's another case, which is altogether far more terrifying if you think about it, and says something very fundamental about, you know, what's happened, that place where the two Americas, the functional one, rubs up against the America that is no longer even part of our country.
Well, I mean, that's exactly the thing that seems germane to me and what you spoke about so eloquently tonight. And it's there in Homicide: A Year on the Killing Streets, is even in death, the people of Baltimore, there are citizens that count and there are citizens that don't.
Murders that matter, the detectives used to say.
And you write about the red balls in that for me was just this extraordinary, unthinkable illustration of that inequality. Can you talk about that a bit?
In reality, and I would imagine this happens in any major urban police department. I don't doubt that it happens in Australia.
We don't have crime in Australia.
Well, you know, listen, I know about your bikies. Nobody will take your country seriously unless you begin to call them bikers. I'm a giver. I'm here to give. But I think everywhere there are certain murders. They happen in tourist areas. They happen to people who it scares the living shit out of society. Suddenly there's a murder that is, you know, the wolves didn't carry off somebody from the fringe that you weren't, you know, the wolf showed up and it was, I'll use my own city. It was a young undergraduate languages student at Hopkins, you know, killed just off campus, or it's an old woman killed inside a house in Mountain Washington. You know, homeowner, no rental properties. You don't solve murders like that. This is the reality. The murders like that, or one in the Inner Harbor. If somebody were to get killed, somebody gets killed down near Circular Quay, it's got to matter a lot more than if they're killed in a housing project, in a poor area of Sydney. All the detectives are called out, all the resources are there, the mayor's on the phone, the murder will be solved yesterday. And it invariably, to a far greater extent than the average murder, it is. Because you're dealing with the city's sense of itself. And by the city's sense of itself, I'm talking about the taxpayers, the tax base. You don't want them running. And so at that moment, you see the sort of society's will actually come into focus. And you see everything is available to make the outcome the best it possibly can be. Whereas, if a 19-year-old drug dealer falls in West Baltimore and there's no one there to hear it, does he make a sound? It's very cynical, and yet that's exactly how the civic firmament exists.
So did your time embedded amongst the police in writing that book change your sense of your own city?
Oh, sure. It certainly made me respect good police work. There's so much crime on television that almost anyone thinks they know what detectives do, and no one does. No one knows what a good detective does, because there's a lot that is incredibly nuanced that you sort of have to be in the room. You have to be in the room to see how an interrogation works, over the course of several hours. And of course, since you have to solve everything by the last commercial break in most television, it made me really respect police work. It made me also see how distant one America was from the other. How, 20 blocks away from where I live, I still live in Baltimore, and 20 blocks away is a completely different country. And we share certain cultural reference points, but only certain ones. And we share no sense of the same future. And that schizophrenia is so certain and so intact and so astonishing to me, that there's these two Americas, and people are being driven to one or the other. We're minting new millionaires every day, but our middle class is being eviscerated, and people are slipping more and more into a working class that has no work. So, yeah, the city felt. I like those guys. I like the detectives. They were interesting guys.
That comes through in your writing, and it's one of many fascinating tensions in there, is your awareness of the individual good work being done and people who believe in what they're doing and are passionate about it, and what institutions do to those people and to that work, and the failure of those institutions.
Yeah, and they're all more vulnerable than not as we've gone along. Obviously out of my own newsroom, I watched hundreds of worthy people attrited. And not just from the internet. I took the third buyout for my paper, and 80 people left. And that was before the internet. It was just Wall Street had figured out if you put out shittier newspapers, you'll make more money. And very, very precisely, that was the equation. So, journalists were worthless. I saw police officers, once they started emphasizing the stats of the drug war rather than actual police work, they were worthless. They could be marginalized. If the institution doesn't actually prize labor, bad things happen. And that, of course, that's true of a drug corner as well. If everybody on a drug corner has an expiration date marked on their ass because nobody expects anybody to be a good and valued employee and to survive for any decent length, without getting locked up or killed or shot. Okay, then who's the next guy? You barely need to learn the next guy's name. Just what's your street name? stand there, So, yeah, if you like people, if you're interested in people, and you're sort of staring at one of these worlds where there are more and more people at the margins, it's really sad in a way. More than if they're just people you don't know.
I'm going to try and strike a note of optimism just to fly in the face of everything else, which is this. It seems to me, watching Treme, that you're making a case that goes beyond the failure of institutions. That's still a feature of it, the way it has been in your earlier work, the way it is in The Wire. But you seem to be making a case about the power of community, the power of individuals, the power
Indeed.
of culture to transcend those failures.
Indeed. There are so many things to love about being an American that are at stake here as our institutions falter and as people are diminished as a whole. What's at stake is a very vibrant idea of what America is and what its potentialities were, and what I think if you asked Americans 50 or 60 years ago, or maybe not that long, but 40 or 50 years ago, about our future and about their own sense of being an American, I think it would have been very different for a lot of people. I can't answer that definitively. I'm not that old, but. Treme is a story of what a city's capable of, what an American multicultural, pluralistic society can do, and what urban society can do, especially. New Orleans, nothing works in the town. In some ways, it makes you pine for Baltimore. Terrible school system, incredibly corrupt and brutal police department, dysfunctional courts, politics is hilariously corrupt, and yet the culture is so distinctly American. It can only happen in America, African American culture, and it's such a powerful engine that it keeps people in place. It keeps them saying, "I'm a New Orleanian." I mean, Treme is probably the most patriotic piece I'll write. That's my form of patriotism is, and it's not like these people are being political when they go into all of the ritual that comes with asserting for culture in New Orleans. They're not thinking, I'm doing this because I believe in that. They're doing it because it's what they need to do. It's who they are. It's how they've been, how their city's always been, and to watch them use the one tool that actually worked in that city, which was culture, to watch them use it after Katrina to assert for their sense of community, that's about as optimistic as I'm ever going to get.
Does that, now you're producing cultural output rather than journalism yourself, if you like. You're an entertainer.
Apostasy, that's right. I'm an entertainer. And not a very good one. Because nobody watches the shows when they're on the air. No, they don't. You all didn't. You can admit it. But, you can admit it.
We don't get television here.
No wonder it's such a benign society. No wonder you're doing so well. I'm in the entertainment industry, and yes, the stories have to be entertaining and the characters have to be engaging. But I do feel as if what I've done at the end of the day is make an entertainment that didn't, again, produce some kind of, or put forth some kind of argument. I would, then having left newspapers and having left journalism entirely, would truly feel like apostasy, like I was, couldn't stand in the sight of my father's ghost or something.
But, you joked before about getting questions about killing Stringer Bell or about Omar, but you've had the cultural influence that you have a president who identifies a gay shotgun-toting gangster as his favorite character in a TV show.
I'm amazed that that wasn't thrown at him in exactly that language during the election. When he said it, as somebody who's usually to the left of the Democratic Party and therefore votes Democratic, I winced and I thought, you didn't mean to say that. Listen, we liked writing Omar too, and we liked working with Michael, and we liked, it's storytelling, and we like telling a good story, and we all like writing the characters, I don't mean to diminish the joy you have of just putting people on a page and then seeing it transformed into film and what works and what doesn't and editing it and the finished part. It's all wonderful. It's a great gig. Years later, when people come up, to me anyway, and other writers' mileage may vary, but I really love it when they want to argue about what's gone wrong with public education or why journalism is failing.
Or if Amsterdam's a good idea.
Yeah, or if Amsterdam's a good idea. Those are the arguments. And I can't help it. It's like I'd rather hear somebody engaged in the argument that we were trying to leave behind. It makes me feel better than if somebody says, oh man, I love the scene where he, the way that happened, and and I love the montage, and why'd you pick that song? It's like, man, that's just all tools in the box. You're asking me like, wow, that's that hammer, the way you use that hammer, motherfucker, we built a house, What do you think of the house? Fuck the hammer, or I like season 2, except I didn't like this, or season 5. It's like, so you like the mantle and the balustrade and that one section of the stairwell, but what about the fucking house? Do you want to live in the house?
For what it's worth, I don't think anyone gives a shit about the hammer. They're more nervous about the nail gun on that particular house. You've seen the show more recently than me. Sorry, man, massive dork.
You have that stuff right at your fingertips.
It's
just
embarrassing. I'm sorry about that. I won't keep doing that. In fact, I am going to throw to the audience for questions. So the house lights are going to come up. There are fixed microphones on either side of every single floor, including the one at the top. I know you think we don't know you're up there, but we do. If you can keep your questions brief, because, well, look how many of you there are, and just keep them brief, frankly. But while they're gathering themselves and the house lights possibly come up a little brighter, I'm just guessing, just one more question. You had on your terrific blog under the title, The Audacity of Despair, you got into something of a stoush with some of your readers about your response to the Trayvon Martin case. And there were stupid internet commenters misreading something. But
as they are wont to do.
Yeah, no, it's their specialty. But you posted a reply where you talked about how pride in your country can only be a real thing if there's also shame in your country.
Absolutely.
And acknowledgement of good is only meaningful if you can also acknowledge evil. And I was curious about that language, given you're so resistant to reducing anything to good or evil in your work. Do you believe in evil as a...
I do believe in evil. But I'm with Hannah Arendt. I believe in the banality of evil is even more of a challenge to the human condition than sociopathy. I mean, somebody is a sociopath and they're out to do harm. That is a very simple story. That is a very fundamental. But I haven't met a lot of, I covered crime in Baltimore for 15 years, and I didn't meet a lot of sociopaths. There were a few, but there were people who were sort of completely devoid of just that soulless. Mostly, I met a lot of people who were in circumstances where doing the wrong thing seemed plausible. and seemed like a rational act, and seemed to some of them like it was inevitable even. And that's far more disturbing and more interesting to me as a writer. I mean, The Wire is about process. It's about, and most of my writing is about process. I think there are writers out there that can do good and evil better than I can. I'm really good at process and how society pretends to array itself and then how it actually works or doesn't work.
All right, we'll start down here.
Hi, my question is about that. You peeled away so many layers in The Wire. Did it have an effect on the real society? Did seeing themselves reflected back with those institutions and things that were good and bad about them, did it change anything?
Oh, I don't know. I should tell a story on myself. The reason I got hired at the Baltimore Sun was I caught the basketball coach at the University of Maryland in a scandal that should have ended his career. It wasn't. I got lucky. I was the stringer covering the campus, trying to write my way onto the paper, and I caught him harassing and threatening a girl who had gone to a campus judicial board for a player had sort of a third-degree sexual assault at a party, not a rape, but he had picked her up, and it had been inappropriate. And the player made a mistake, and he was held out of the NCAA playoffs that year. And the basketball coach was so furious, he was calling this woman at home, at the dorm room, and screaming that he was going to, her name would be trash, and he would ruin her life. And finally, she called another university administrator who came down and actually picked up the phone and heard the basketball coach screaming this stuff at her, at an undergraduate. And I reported all this, and I thought, they're going to have to fire him. They're going to have to fire Lefty Driesell, famous basketball coach at the time. And instead, they did an investigation, and he apologized without apologizing. One of those sort of mistakes were made, passive, And they gave him a 5-year contract for more money than I hope to ever see in my life, not knowing that I was going to get into television. So at that moment, I wanted to be a reporter at the time Watergate was happening, and you change the terrain, you right or wrong. At that moment, I saw that happen, and I said, you know what? I'm going to go crazy if I actually think to myself, you tell a story, and then things get better. You can't be responsible for everything, and the thing I can be responsible for is the story, is to not cheat the story. If I get the story right, that's exhausting enough. That's journey enough. Sometimes something might happen. Sometimes things might not happen. Sometimes they might look at it and say there ought to be a law, and they'll pass a law to make it worse. I'm responsible for the story, and that's my job, and I take it very seriously. But, another way of coming around to that answer is The Wire was also an argument against the drug war, fundamentally. The drug war is still going on. There's still 2.3 million Americans in prison and climbing. So, if good stuff happens, it happens. But the trick is ripping out the rearview mirror and just telling stories. For me, anyway.
Thank you. We're going to go right up to the top there. Just look directly into the light. That's where they are.
That's right.
I was just wondering why you use television at all to tell your stories. Why not another medium?
Strangely, people watch television. and somewhere my wife is nodding her head because she's a best-selling novelist. And she'll tell you the economy of scale is such that if you sell 100,000 hardbacks, you're on the New York Times bestseller list. But even Treme, a show that nobody's pretty much watching, in its 4 or 5 airings on HBO in a given week, an episode will be seen by 2, 3, 4 million people total. And then you add in the box sets and the HBO downloads and the people stealing it off BitTorrent, and 10,000 here, 10,000 there, pretty soon you got a real audience. But so having seen that you can sort of make an argument and get people fired up over it, I haven't gone back to prose writing as much as I would have liked, or as much as I thought it was. There was no calculation on my part to become a TV writer. It happened it's almost a boring story, but things happened, shit happened. And it did happen, but then once I realized you could actually engage an argument here and get people talking a little bit in a way that, people just don't read anymore. It's astonishing and it's sad, but it's true. And let's face it, film has become, by film I mean television and all of it, has become the predominant storytelling medium of our time.
I'm interested though, you're an accidental TV writer, but you seem to have deliberately surrounded yourself with other non-TV writers for your collaboration. You've got ex-cops and teachers and a lot of novelists.
And I don't hire anybody who's written like a lot of TV, because I worry about the soul of some kid who's 14 years old and lying in bed and saying, I really want to write television drama, It's like, anything, but be a fireman, be an astronaut, for God's sakes. Aspire to something other than that. And I find that people who have been in the industry, they tend to want to write for the templates that really are hits, that people watch, that people watch CSI, people watch other things that, to me, have no value. They don't. No, I'm sorry if you like it, but to me, there's no argument behind it, even if it's well made. There's no argument. It's basically there to hold an audience and sustain a franchise. And so, what is, if you go to LA and you work on this show and that show, you get an idea of what works, and nothing we're doing works. So you can't help me, because I'm making TV that nobody should be making. It's a mistake.
I've got to admit, applaud a mistake. I think that's a good idea. I've got to admit, I've stuffed up my research. I thought CSI was one of yours, so I'm glad I didn't get to those questions. That would have been really awkward.
If it was...
Hi, David. Expatriate here from San Francisco. Anyway, one of the big problems in metropolises like San Francisco and New York City is that the middle class is being priced out because of rising rent and things like that. It's getting to the point, actually, where people can't even really afford to live in the places where they work, such as like the Intermission or the Tenderloin or the Lower East Side or whatever. So I'm curious to know, where do you see the future of this trend going, and what do you think can be done to stop it so that people can actually afford to live where they work?
You're absolutely right. The geography of the new sort of bifurcated schizophrenic America is there are areas that are becoming almost crime-free and perfectly policed. And, the story of how New York became the safest city in America, dramatically so, and almost, if you ever went there or know about it in the 70s or early 80s, it was astonishingly dangerous, famously dangerous. And now it's one of the safest places in America, the streets of New York. And the narrative that the media bought was that Rudy Giuliani, the tough prosecutor who became the mayor, he started arresting everybody for everything. And, you couldn't, the guys who came to squeegee your windshield when you came through the Midtown Tunnel, they were gone. And the people who jaywalked, they were down at the Tombs. And the people who dropped a cigarette, in Times Square, they woke up in a jail cell. And pretty soon they got the message. And that's the Rudy Giuliani story. And he convinced a lot of other people around the country that was the truth. So that zero tolerance was the phrase. Zero tolerance became something practiced in cities that, other than New York. It was the mantra of the mayor in my city, in Baltimore, zero tolerance. It worked in New York. He started locking up people to such a degree that it was astonishing. It was, 60, 70,000 arrests for the most, 24,000 people actually got down to the jail in police wagons, and they couldn't figure out what to charge them with, so they let them go. The ACLU finally filed suit. Well, the reason it didn't work, and by the way, crime stayed high. The reason it didn't work in Baltimore, but it worked in New York, is because it's what I was ranting about, which is people in New York made a ton of money on the Wall Street run-up, and they rebuilt New York. They rebuilt the entire island of Manhattan, and then they turned on Brooklyn, and even the Bronx, even parts of the Bronx. Your chance of getting mugged now in Alphabet City or Morningside Heights, the only thing that's going to mug you there is like, a 2-star restaurant at this point. The entire real estate of New York became so valuable and so priced that the people who actually work in the service industry can't afford to live there, as you say. That's one America. In Baltimore, that money, that real estate, they were just chasing people around the wreckage of the Rust Belt America that hasn't fixed itself. So there, all the arrests in the world, all the pretend Rudy Giuliani bullshit didn't accomplish anything except create misery. Yet if you talk to people from New York, they think they have a clue about how they combated crime. They combated crime by making the city utterly devoid of any class that might be even remotely desperate. They managed to push one America so far away or so far to the outer boroughs that nobody had to worry about it anymore. And I think the same is true in other places like San Francisco or West LA or Northwest Washington. There are places that are utterly secure. And one America is barely talking to the other anymore, except to stereotype each other.
Over here.
Getting back on the topic of Amsterdam, looking at how effective it has been in other countries recently, do you believe the decriminalization and regulation of drugs at this point in time would be effective in America at all? Oh, and why'd you kill Stringer Bell?
I do think... What was the last part?
Why did you kill Stringer Bell?
Very good. Well done. I do think it would... I'm about harm reduction. It would do less harm. It's not done anything good. As I said, it's had no effect on the rate of drug use, on the quality of drugs, on the dynamic of the underground economy. It's just put a lot of human beings in jail. And every time you put somebody in jail, you're not punishing one person. You're destroying that person's connection to family. You're weakening the community. You're weakening the family structure, the community structure. And you are creating this incredible gulag of nonviolent offenders that I think is a drain on the American soul and on our spirit. And ultimately, you're wasting a lot of treasure. If I could just have all the money, everyone thinks that there isn't the money to do what Roosevelt did in 32 or 33 with the CCC or the NRA, sort of manufacturing work. I'm a Keynesian. I believe in that fundamentally, that works. I'm all over that. If I could just have the money that they're wasting on pretending to interdict drugs as if it matters, on putting dope on the table and kicking in this door and paying the DEA to man this case, and then all the money of pretrial and all the money in detention and all the money in the prison system and parole. And if I could just have what they spend on the drug defendants and just throw it into job training and job programs in the inner city and try to reconnect one America to the other on even the most basic economic terms. How could you do any worse than what we're doing? How could you do any worse? If it doesn't work, you've had no effect on the drug war, and drugs are available to anyone who wants them, which they are now. And you've wasted a lot of money putting people back to work, and put it, money, paychecks that are going out that, hey, one thing you pay those guys at the end of the week, it's going right back into the economy. They're spending every last dollar. No, instead, let's argue about whether we should continue to give the 1%, have a tax break so that money can go into their bank accounts or make their boat payments or whatever. It's so astonishing that this has gone on for as long as it has. Usually you fail at a war for 40 years, and unless you're arguing about God and it's the 13th or 12th or 13th. When was the 100 Years' War? I'm sure you know that.
Please don't ask me that.
Yeah.
Which one? There were a few.
Right. Unless you're arguing about God and it's the Middle Ages, they usually call an end to we didn't fight Vietnam for that long, and it just goes on and on and on. It's astonishing.
I think we've only got time for one more question. I mention that because we're going to go right up to the top, but you understand it's the last question. There's an incredible amount of pressure on you right now. Like an incredible amount.
I just wanted to say that I'm a really big fan of Tremaine. I'm really excited for the final season next month. So thank you.
You now join my mother and my cousins and about 340 musicians in New Orleans.
But yeah, no, I was wondering, you were talking about how Marx is a terrible clinician, and you also said that the idea of, the proverbial brick as a way of fixing some of the social inequality. How do you deal with the middle section between some sort of revolution? I mean, the guy who shot up LAX is probably, if he's shooting at the TSAs, probably has lots of problems with government, that kind of thing. So how do you have, those are probably going to be your people who are throwing the bricks. How do you stop those people from being in control of a new governmental system, and how do you...
I know what you're saying. I would answer it this way. The people who throw the bricks are never in control. And when I say the brick, what I'm speaking of, let's go back to a fundamental moment in the 1960s, 1967, 1968. America was still incredibly resistant to civil rights, although things were changing painfully in the South. But where it wasn't changing was the idea of economic opportunity extending into these disadvantaged communities. There was still an incredible amount of poverty in the inner city. And summers in America in the mid-'60s, from the Watts riot to Detroit, and ultimately culminating in the massive riots after the death of Dr. King. The long, hot summer was a very real thing, and people were scared shitless. The government was scared that the Kerner Commission report in '67 said we could lose cities. This could become army of occupation shit in America. And when '68 finally happened, nothing on the ground in those areas that burned, and I was a resident of a city that was burned. The whole Northwest Corridor went up in flames. Nothing good happened on the ground. People died, a lot of property was lost, a lot of tragedy. But something did happen politically in the country, which is capital yielded in some fundamental ways. Suddenly there was an urban policy. Suddenly things like UDAG grants and community block grants became a second language for American government. And if you know anything about the origins of the black middle class in my country, it comes with government spending on the cities. Not merely because the programming was aimed at reducing the underclass and re-engaging the underclass, but because they hired a bunch of people from these communities to be part of the programming. And that was the origins of a very wide and significant black middle class that continued to grow over the next 20, 25 years. And that, George Palcano says he he can remember after the riots, his father had a diner down in D.C. He can remember people walking around, African Americans walking around with a lot more pride. Because of the riot and what happened in the riot, no. But because what the riot said, which was, you can't go down this road forever without us rebelling, without us saying we're not going to be second-class citizens, we're not going to be ignored, we're not going to have our leaders killed, we're not going to be marginalized anymore. And that happened. The brick itself, it's not like the people who threw the bricks acquired any personal power or were able to overturn the government. It's that they finally got somebody's attention. And when enough people are out of work and enough people have been, every time the economy shrugs, it throws off people, white, black, brown, and it throws off more people out of one American to the other. And when that group starts to become untenable for the rest of America to ignore, that's when you start getting programming. Things happen out of fear that if we don't address this, it's going to get worse. And right now, the sense of what's at stake, I don't think there's a politician in America that's fully cognizant of it. So that's what I mean by the brick. When the bricks got thrown in 67, 68, it transformed our way of looking at the cities, and it made us behave differently as a society. So it's certainly the cruelest way to affect change, and it's certainly appallingly brutal, and it certainly means that innocent people get hurt. And I'm not advocating for it, but I am acknowledging that sometimes it's in those moments where you demonstrate, the Haymarket riot, which was basically the beginning of American labor in the 1880s. People were at a less than subsistence wage in Chicago. The lumber workers, the Pullman workers, they were making less than what they needed to survive. And so it came to the point of somebody throwing a bomb. But at that point, the martyrdom of those people on May Day, the martyrdom of the people they hung, whether they had anything to do with throwing the bomb or not, that moment created a dynamic where the thing they were fighting for in the Pullman strike and the Haymarket that followed, which was the 5-day work week, 40-hour work week, became inevitable. They scared the hell out of the people in Chicago, and they scared the hell out of the country, and somebody stepped in and said, you know what, we better give a little, or it's going to get worse. So that's what I mean.
I think any idea is only as dangerous as the argument that it generates and the conversation that can spring from it. And I personally feel very privileged to have shared a stage with this man tonight. Please join me in thanking the extraordinary David Simon.
I want to say, I've done 2 nights now with Michael. And he's genuinely quicker than I am. And he doesn't stumble over his words, and he's really, he pivots beautifully. And I know that he could run, I can look over at him and I can know that he's like holding back. Like let's just let him go, let him go. He'll get there eventually. Thank you very much.
Honestly, you've seen